Hi, everyone. We're talking today about the overlap between open source communities and accessibility and opportunities for better leveraging open source software for accessibility projects. My name is Sarah Kasabian, and I'm the blog editor. And I'm joined today by these wonderful folks. If you could all just briefly introduce yourselves for the video.
Sure. My name's Brendan O'Leary, and I'm a developer evangelist here at GitLab.
I'm Greg Myers. I work in GitLab support, and I am the open source support liaison at GitLab.
I'm Jeremy Alder. I work in the UX department, specifically on the UX Foundations team as a senior product designer.
All right, great. So my first question is, when you think about the overlap between open source and accessibility, what are some of the first things that really come to mind as we talk about this topic, these two topics?
I think I could jump in. For me, from a UX standpoint and a design standpoint, one of the things that stands out to me with the pairing of open source and accessibility is the fact that when you make something more accessible, you have more access to a wider community to provide input for that. And then conversely, when you make something more accessible, I feel like there's potentially a larger audience that can take advantage of the benefit of that product having those features.
Yeah, I agree. I think the biggest, relationship between the two are the ability to, collaborate with more people, right? In theory, the beauty of open source is, you can collaborate with anyone and get a lot of diverse input and thought into what you're trying to build. Well, accessibility, aims to kind of do the same thing, right? Like we want to make sure that as we're building things, we're building it with a diverse set of folks that are going to use it and maybe be able to use it in different ways or need to be able to use it in different ways than you or I. And so I could think on the surface, the two are directly related, just like Jeremy was saying.
Yeah, I echo what Brendan and Jeremy brought up. I would also say that I feel one thing, a distinguishing feature of open source software versus proprietary software is that open source software tends to be used by a wide community of users with different priorities, needs, use cases, whereas proprietary software vendors, they can often steer the direction that their users will use the software. Open source, you often find a lot of situations where you did not expect that people would want this feature or need this feature, possibly even accessibility. And then by it being open source, having collaboration and contribution encouraged, things get surfaced as issue or merge requests that would boost functionality of software in a way the designers did not initially think of, and make it available to a broader audience.
Yeah, I think those are great points. One thing that stands out to me, and I was in a discussion yesterday about this, is that accessibility is not an afterthought either. It's inclusive design. Accessibility is part of inclusive design, which happens at the beginning of thinking through features and workflows. And you're not highlighting maybe a disability per se as much as you are considering different workflows and different ways of handling tasks, kind of like you mentioned. And one of the benefits with GitLab is the fact that we do have global users, and we do have a diverse user base, and so because of that, we're able to look at it from a workflow and a standpoint of features that allow somebody to get their work done in a variety of ways, and that does include keyboard only or screen reader or mouse, touch, etc. But it also includes somebody that might need keyboard enhancements because they're typing quickly and it makes their job faster, or they're doing development things in Web IDE and shortcuts are more helpful. So there's a lot of things that are overlapping when you think about it from a workflow standpoint and really satisfying those needs. When you do that, accessibility is often just baked into those processes.
Yeah, that's a really good point. A lot of times people hear accessibility and they think only about, folks that are differently abled or might need, might be visually impaired and have to use a keyboard only. But like to Jeremy's point, inclusive design would include them and really even more, right? Like it's even wider than that in the sense of like, yeah, I use a keyboard better. Like I'm not visually impaired, but I'm faster with a keyboard than I am with a mouse. So I want to be able to interact with software and get my workflow done with a keyboard. And so it's like there's accessibility in the sense of like necessitating that everyone can contribute and everyone can use the software, but also accessibility from the standpoint of like building inclusive of everyone's workflow. Like Jeremy said, I think that's a really good point.
Great. Yeah, those are all really good points. And sort of building off of that, Greg, you added a comment to the issue, really highlighting that, you can think about accessibility and open source in kind of two different ways. One, accessibility, thinking about like functionality that could be used for people with like that are differently abled, perhaps like, for example, visually impaired or require a screen reader and things like that. But also thinking about accessibility in terms of the fact that, open source is built on the idea that everybody can contribute, and making software easier to use, obtain, modify, understand, and contribute to paraphrase what you said. So could you sort of elaborate a bit more on that, like thinking about accessibility in those two like different sort of ways?
Yeah. So, and this kind of goes into my background a bit. So for roughly about 2 years, I worked as a web developer in a role where part of my job was running automated accessibility tests on web applications and websites, mainly e-commerce, to ensure that it would be accessible and available to folks with different abilities. And so I think in that regard, there is a somewhat well-defined checklist of things we can optimize for to make sure that regardless of your physical abilities or who you are, what your abilities are, you can get value out of website or software. And then I was thinking kind of more in this general broader sense of open source, and possibly tying into diversity and inclusion, is that open source is it's based on a community. And I personally feel the more diverse and inclusive that community is, the better the end product is. And so I think in that regard, there may be some items that you might consider accessibility or boosting accessibility. For example, making sure that people could use software cross-platform. They're not limited by a specific operating system. You don't have to buy an expensive MacBook to use it, something like that. Or like the ability to like run it. Do you have to compile this software from source, or is there packages that make it easy to install this software? Those are kind of different barriers to entry, possibly more on the development or contributor side. But I think there's two meanings, and they do kind of go hand in hand.
I think that's a great point, Greg. And to that, I would, I guess how I've kind of defined it is more that the latter that you're speaking of is more about inclusive design, where when we talk about the actual requirements and the output, we get accessible design. And so when we consider the use cases of different platforms and capabilities, the way we build it results in more accessible experiences. So it's kind of that inclusive thinking that's further left of the actual implementation. So.
Yeah, I think having that qualifying adjective really helps. I definitely agree there. Good point.
So when you're thinking about, how open source software developers can build more accessible software products, what are some things that you think that are being done well in open source communities, and also things that could be improved?
Yeah, I might start with the second half of that, which is, I think that sometimes folks, we've been painting like a pretty nice picture of, how the open source and having folks involved and contributing, and more folks involved can add to accessibility. But I also think that the inverse happens a lot in open source when a project's maybe not as mature or it's just starting out. And accessibility is one of many things probably that gets put on the back burner as like an afterthought. And to Greg's point, this is something I think about a lot, because to Greg's point, there's a very clear set of checklists, like probably can be improved, but it's not an unsolved problem in software to how to make your software accessible and inclusive. It just takes, putting the effort in to do that. A silly thing that even is not that big of a deal, something I deal with all the time, right? My last name has an apostrophe in it. And a lot of systems don't like to take an apostrophe in that. And like, I'm an engineer, I understand why, like apostrophes, single quotes, SQL statements and that kind of thing, that's bad. But like, it's a solved problem of how to fix that. It just takes you, thinking about and caring about it, to solve it and fix it. And again, that's not that big a deal. Like, that's easy for me to get over and understand how to work around. Because again, I'm a technologist and I understand how to work around it. But for folks that may not be able to work around something so easily, it can be really exclusive and make them feel not included if you don't choose to do those things that I think I would say are not hard. They're easy, but they do take some effort, right? Like they do take time to think about. And so I think that open source in general can probably do a much better job of that as a whole. Even though we have a lot of folks that care about that in the community, it's like you need to invest the time to do that well.
I think, Greg, you can go ahead if you'd like, but one of the things that I think is done well with open source is just the ability to have everybody provide their take and their perspective. So when you look at issues or ticketing systems, the ability for somebody just to say, hey, this is the problem I have, to document it, and for that to be elevated and visible and have the same weight as somebody else submitting an issue, I think is something that's positive, and I found it to be helpful on my work when I get a UX ping and it's something that deals with accessibility or something related from a community contribution. It's very helpful, and I think it elevates their voice, and it also provides us with more awareness of that. So I think that is a positive.
So yeah, I think really good points, Jeremy and Brendan, to kind of piggyback or add to that. I think in general, the open source community is doing a good job in terms of accessibility testing and ensuring web accessibility, in that there are a lot of tools out there for testing web accessibility, and majority of them are open source. There's also really great communities and projects where they advocate for accessibility testing and improving accessibility in web and software. As a company, I think personally we're doing well because we have everybody can contribute as our mission. And so if somebody has a request, a problem, they find a bug, including if something's not accessible on our website, our documentation, our software, they're invited to create an issue which will actually get passed along to our product team, get prioritized, get acknowledged. Whereas a lot of other companies and products, that's not easily available. And also we have a pretty great contribution workflow where we have a number of community members regularly contributing to our open core project. And I think having a contribution workflow that works for everybody, that's definitely an asset. As far as what we could do better in general, not just at GitLab, I would say it seems accessibility can be thought of as an afterthought, where I think if we just automate it and possibly like just make it a assumed part of DevOps pipelines is accessibility testing, then we can catch these things and address them early on instead of like going back and trying to clean up afterwards.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Greg. And it's like one of those things that is easier to do from the beginning and automate from the beginning, and then than it is to go back and clean it up afterwards. So it's for folks that aren't thinking about it today, they should think about it like that and think about it just like any other part of CI. Like we all have lived the world where we didn't have the best automated CI, we didn't have the best automated testing, we didn't have the best automation of our builds, and we know how painful that can be to untangle and fix after you've already spent all this time and effort creating a mess. And the same is true of accessibility. Like it can be a very solved problem. Like Greg said, there's lots and lots of open source tools to help you test your products and that are advocating for web accessibility and integrating them early in the life cycle of your entire product is much easier. And I'm sure Jeremy as a designer could attest to that too. Like it's so much easier to design from the beginning with it in mind than try and fix something that wasn't originally designed with that in mind. It's just that much harder to fight an uphill battle back than it is to just start the right way.
Great. So that really leads well into my next question. Can you think of different open source development communities that really have gone out of their way to shift accessibility left and like integrate it in early on into their development workflows?
One community I can think of would be the Linux community. People who use the Linux desktop, it doesn't seem to matter what distribution you run. There is a screen reader built in and there's accessibility features included. And to be completely transparent, I just started that up and now it's talking to me and I cannot figure out how to close it. But yeah, I do have that readily available.
I'll be honest, on the flip side, I don't feel like there's enough visibility from a design and UX standpoint in open source, or enough representation or involvement in that. I think one of the things that's unique about GitLab is that design is in the code and design is working very closely with the final markup and product. And because of that and how we handle things with issues and MRs, that UX vibe and perspective is provided, where I don't get that impression from other open source because it's more focused around the coding. So that's kind of the converse side of it for me. I would like to see more of that. And I know saying shifting left sounds trite, but more of that involvement in the open source and more voices from a UX and a design perspective to help champion some of these ideas in that type of a platform, I think would be beneficial.
Yeah, I agree. I think you see it best expressed normally when it's either those large, communities like Linux. Um, I would say that a lot of the open source that's sponsored by large, industry providers like, um, Googles and Facebooks of the world, many of those have a lot of accessibility features built right in. But to Jeremy's point, like they also have teams of UX and design folks that are thinking about those things. Whereas someone that's building an open source tool that might just be quote unquote aimed at developers might think, oh, I don't need to care about the user experience. Well, obviously it can be just as important to make sure you're enabling everyone to be able to contribute and use your tool regardless of who your intended audience is, and what their intended technical level is. You still want to be thinking through how is this going to be usable by people that may come at the problem differently, or have a different set of needs when they're using the tool.
Could you think of any open source communities that have really gone out of their way to engage like differently abled developers or technical folks from a development standpoint and also from like a testing standpoint, instead of just sort of running these like automated accessibility tests, like actually using real people to navigate technology, for instance?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not 100% sure that I can think of one off the top of my head. Um, I'm sure, and Greg may know more than this of me, that probably at least some, or if not all, of the Linux distributions probably involve that, because I know there's a lot of folks that work on those kinds of tools, that work in like a various different ways, right? Some are all text only and won't even open a web page with images on it. And so I think that those kinds of, again, larger open source communities probably get that more often, versus someone that intentionally does work beyond that. I'm not sure I can think of one, but I'm sure they're out there.
I think it can be a challenge just because there's a lot of sensitivity around it. It's sometimes it's HIPAA or privacy concerns with engaging in different disabilities, and so it's more of an opt-in, open-ended type of an approach, which I don't know that I've seen anybody that's quite nailed it down yet. I'm sure there are good examples of it, but I haven't seen it in practice in an open source way yet, because of some of the liability and sensitivity around it.
Yeah, and I think one group that may not be only an open source group, but that I've seen do a lot of work in this area is actually the United States Digital Service Group. So that's a group that is part of the U.S. government, but is designed to kind of be this, like, I don't know, startup within the U.S. government, right? They're very technology focused and trying to bring top technologies and technologists into the U.S. government, and how citizens access federal government services, et cetera, how veterans interact with the healthcare system, how immigration applications for naturalization work. Those tools are traditionally very outdated and old and hard to use, and the U.S. Digital Service is a group that works on across the government to fix that problem. And the U.S. government is actually one that sets a lot of standards that many folks point to when it comes to web accessibility or accessibility in general. And so, like, they aren't necessarily the owner. I'm sure they, as I say this, they have some open source projects. They're not the owners of these large open source projects, but they are someone who is out in industry, pushing folks to make sure that they're considering those kinds of accessibility features when putting together projects.
So is there anything that I haven't asked about that you want to speak to about, the opportunities that exist within open source communities for better leveraging accessibility initiatives or projects, or anything beyond that?
I guess I'd like to know if there are other areas of open source that are done really well that have a very parallel path, right? So when we talk about feature sets, or we talk about just delivery and the business opportunity, things like that, are there parallel paths that would be a really good case study for how to incorporate inclusive design earlier in a product?
And again, I'm sure Greg has a lot of opinion here too, but one thing I'd love to hear is from folks who may be using GitLab or maybe just trying to integrate accessibility testing into their workflow. Before I was an evangelist at GitLab, I was actually a product manager for our CI portion of GitLab. And one of the things we built when I was there as a team was like accessibility built into the GitLab merge request. And again, we're leveraging open source there, right? Like we're using PA11Y, which is an open source tool to do web accessibility testing. To your point, Sarah, I'd love to hear from folks that are using that and where it maybe works well and maybe where it falls short of answering that question in an automated fashion. Like we know in everything when we test software, there's a lot that you can do with automated testing and there's a limit. But it's by examining those limits that I think we can continually get better and improve. And so I'd love to hear more about that from anyone who's using open source web accessibility tooling.
So do you see a future where we integrate like accessibility within the DevOps workflow that, is built into the GitLab product? Like, do you think that this would be something that we ought to consider as a company and as a product to better embrace accessibility?
I would love it if there was like a CI pipeline or something where you define the endpoint or where the software is deployed to, and then it does automate the checklist items of accessibility testing. I think that'd be great. I do think there's tooling out there, and I think we could wrap it in a CI job. And yeah, I see a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, I know we have our like our accessibility merge request widget, and I think that's what you were alluding to, Brennan, is making sure that that's, I think, more baked in and understanding the limits of that. I think even having default projects that have like an accessibility, like, hey, this is out of the box, kind of a bootstrapped approach where there's pipelines and other things set up to manage accessibility, where there's issue or merge request templates that have checklists and say, have you thought about this? Considering that we can only automate so much testing, offset that up front where we're gathering user requirements to write accessible, jobs to be done and user stories or whatever it might be that help to kind of shape some of those things and shape that thinking for teams where it might be new or for those that just need a reference point. So that's one thought for me.
Kind of backtreading to companies or organizations that would specifically have individuals instead of automation do testing. I know there's a concept of beta testers in open source projects where users of a software project will opt in to trying the latest features or functionality, and they will test it out firsthand. And if they notice any problems, they're to create an issue in the relevant issue tracker. I'm wondering, yeah, maybe we could do something along those lines where we say, hey, we're trying to improve accessibility. If we'd like you to get involved, like, can you test it out? And if you notice anything, create an issue, add the accessibility label, something along those lines. So we get kind of the best of both worlds. We get feedback from actual users, and we could do the automated merge request scans and things like that.
Okay, great. Well, I am going to stop the recording in just a second, but hopefully you all can stick around for just a few more minutes so we can wrap up. But thank you so much for taking the time to talk about this really important topic. And I really appreciate it. And we'll be posting this on Unfiltered so people can watch and learn. Sorry, Jeremy, did you have something you wanted to add?
I was just going to say thanks for setting it up and for advocating for it and wanting to kind of communicate out everything, and also for the great questions that you posed.
Okay, great. I'm going to stop the recording.